I'm seeing if I can edit this together, so we'll see if it works. But basically, the idea for foot binding was that, by making it smaller, it would make it more attractive. The problem is you can look it up on, just type it into Google and look at the images, and it's actually a pretty hideous thing what ends up happening. And what happens is the foot actually gets sort of, just, basically it becomes melded together as, sort of this clump, and your foot is no longer useful as, in a traditional foot. And so what happens is walking becomes very painful, but the idea is it is a sign of beauty. And so the people who would have this done were oftentimes upper class women who wanted, who were going to try to marry up and marry in. But if you were a worker, you would never probably have done this because it would have been considered harmful. But people will say here in the West, we do the same thing. I mean, women shove their foot into high heels and end up hurting it. And so how are we any different? How are we any better for our view of female beauty than theirs? When women shove their feet into these high heels that end up causing the foot to have damage that is very negative. The other side is things like female genital mutilation. It's a practice that's actually been banned in most of the world, although it still exists in certain tribal areas of North Africa. And essentially what foot binding, or what female genital mutilation is sometimes called female circumcision. And the idea is similar to male circumcision, where they cut off the foreskin. With this, they cut off the labia of the female. And so what happens is the reason is, by doing so, they render a female unable to enjoy sexual intercourse. And the idea is that by doing that, it will make a wife or a woman more faithful to her husband. And so by performing female circumcision or female genital mutilation, they are helping to assure her fidelity to her husband and make her a better wife. And so the positive is, that it renders them incapable of enjoying of sexual intercourse. The negative is oftentimes, because these aren't done in particularly sanitary conditions, that the little girls they do this to, who are 2 and 3, become infected and die. In some cases, it just becomes severely infected and causes scarring and other things, so that every time when they get older and have sexual intercourse, it causes a great deal of pain. And so the problem is that, one of the problems that exists with this is that the female genital mutilation is sometimes called, or female circumcision, is that it in fact, either leads to death or causes severe pain. And so some people would say, this is an act and that's why it's been banned. And so some of you are beginning to say, well, yeah, that seems a little bit over the line. I mean, that's not the same as wearing high heels, and women make that choice. That's not the same as foot binding, or it's not the same as spanking or capital punishment, whatever. You're kind of beginning to draw a line. But there are also countries where, there's the old thing like the rule of thumb. Maybe it's a little anachronistic. I don't know that people, but I mean, the idea that, you could, beat your wife as long as the stick you used was no wider than your thumb. That was sort of where the rule of thumb, the story of where it comes from. And, so you can hit your wife if it's no bigger than your thumb. And so, spousal abuse is okay in some cultures. Perhaps child abuse, or, in some cultures it was considered, in Greek society, it was okay for, young males before puberty were considered to be feminine. And so having intercourse with young males having intercourse with basically boys, was not considered a act of homosexuality. It was considered, okay. It was like having sex with a woman. And so that was not negatively looked upon. And so all these become practices that vary culture to culture. I mean, in a certain degree, we're saying child abuse and sexual abuse and spousal abuse are morally acceptable practices in some cultures. And yet, what happens is you get on this continuum where you go from the far end of ethical relativism, of, just customs, to this far end of like spousal and child abuse. You begin to say, this seems okay, it seems relative, and on this side it seems absolutely wrong, that there are rights and wrongs. And the typical ethical relativist will say, well, I don't think that spousal abuse is okay, but I have no reason to say it's not. And so people who are serious about their relativism will say that. But for most people, we end up saying, there does seem to be a distinction. There does need to be a line drawn somewhere in this continuum. That we can't just say everything is culturally bound. There are cultures and they can be wrong, but where is that line drawn and how do we do it is the question.